Today we're talking about the joys and perils of collaboration. And it's December 2020, so it's been quite a year, and it seems like a good time. We just passed through Thanksgiving, and Josh, Daryl, and I have worked together now for really close to 15 years. And when we first met, we probably took for granted some aspects of having good collaborative relationships because we kind of fell into a structure with our mentors. They kind of had already worked out some of the norms of collaboration. But I think as we've gotten into tenure track positions and kind of interacted with other groups, we realized that there are some of the things that we were acculturated into that just helped ease the process of collaboration. And so we wanted to reflect back and just kind of think about, what are the benefits of collaboration and what are some of the ways that that's enriched our work and made work more meaningful and fun. But also over time, some of the things we've learned that might be almost kind of myths about collaboration and some of the perils, some of the ways that can kind of go sideways. So yeah, that's our topic. Maybe to start out, why don't we start out on a positive note? Do you guys have any thoughts on, if you had a doc student kind of coming in and you were trying to help them understand why collaboration is important in our field? What are some of the positive aspects of collaboration?
Yeah, well, maybe we can just go back and forth and talk about some of these, but the one that jumped out to me was that, everyone has different strengths and different weaknesses. And if you're just kind of doing research by yourself, you don't have the opportunity to kind of balance those out. So, for example, just the three of us, I think we have, a pretty cool balance of what we're good at, like Daryl is good at statistics and good at, he's a social psychologist, so he thinks about experiments and how we can really fine tune, our testing our hypotheses. Donnie is more of a big picture guy. And so he's really good at coming up with ideas and brainstorming and being creative and kind of thinking about why our research matters. I'm not actually sure what I'm good at. No, but I think I'm pretty good at like crafting an argument and sort of having a logical progression of thought in our papers. And so, yeah, that was the first thing that came to my mind, is that if you have a group of people working together, you can kind of shore up each other's weaknesses and capitalize on your strengths.
I also like collaborating because it's just fun. So much of what we do is hard work, and you can end up kind of working in isolation unless you're pretty dedicated to making sure that you're being a good collaborator. So I like collaborating because it's fun. It's one of the best parts of the job. Working together, being in a team, is just kind of a really enjoyable aspect. You can also be more productive when you're collaborating. So if you're working on a project and can bring in people with their expertise, and they're working and taking the lead on a project and can rope you in, you can really just become more productive if you have good collaborative relationships. If you have bad collaborative relationships, it can actually torpedo your productivity, but we'll get to that. But if you find a good group to work with, it's a lot of fun and you can be pretty productive.
One other thing I was thinking about related to my first point is you have collaborators who are in different settings and have different kind of groups of relationships. So, like for example, Donnie and I are at doctoral programs at secular universities. Daryl's at a Christian university. We have other collaborators who have access to different types of participants and settings. So that can really help too if you're trying to, put together a larger project with multiple studies of different populations.
Yeah, if I think about a few points of training where it was most helpful, right away it was super helpful just to learn to write at a different level for me, because I got on Ev's team. Ev gave really good feedback, and so that was an aspect. But also the other people on his team, the way we would write we just kind of had a system, and we'll talk more about that later, but of just giving each other feedback. And so I would say within my first semester, I learned more about writing than I learned all throughout college. And, I went to Yale University. I should have gotten trained in writing there, but really I learned more in one semester with Ev. And the way that his team wrote. And Josh is being humble in terms of, his writing skills, but Ev early on realized that Josh was very talented at kind of taking a manuscript that may have some extra wording and was kind of overly verbal. He could take an 80 pager and streamline it down to like 40 pages, probably in a day or maybe a day or two. Ev took advantage of that because he would dictate a chapter, and it would, it was good. It was some good content, but it wasn't necessarily in the right order yet. And, I haven't ever talked with Ev about his approach to training, but my general sense is he actually did that on purpose, was to give us a chance to kind of be part of the process. And so he would give us enough of the content so that we didn't have to spend several, 6 months kind of finding articles. But then Josh was very good at that. And I actually, in my first year or two, learned really quickly to kind of think about, okay, what would Josh do? How would he kind of approach this manuscript? And I could almost try on a different way of thinking. And I think for me, that's actually a big aspect of kind of accelerating your learning process is if someone else is really good at something and you work closely with them, you can almost kind of use empathy and perspective taking to kind of take advantage and learn their skills more quickly. Same thing with Daryl, like having such close access to someone who was investing more of their expertise in kind of causal methods and kind of experimental approaches. It just made it so much quicker to learn something new. And so I think we've kind of continued that trajectory. Is each of us has kind of started to invest in different areas, but then we'll bring our skills back to the group. So Josh, kind of before Daryl and I got more invested in blogging and trying to get into more popular writing. Daryl kind of probably made an earlier investment in really wanting to kind of publish in top tier outlets, like as high as you can go. One of the areas that I've invested is learning like longitudinal methods and trying to get access to kind of higher quality data sets that you could apply some of those methods to. And so we've just kind of continued that early learning of how you can kind of make the process of learning quicker if you have other people who can kind of streamline the process for you. So that's probably the biggest thing that comes to mind to me.
Yeah, it's also, I love all of that. I've also appreciated once you build up enough trust in a good relationship in a collaborative group, they can help you realize early on if your idea is worth pursuing or not. And I remember a very helpful solidifying conversation Donnie and I had one time over the phone where, he said, Daryl, I think we're going to write a lot of papers together. And so I trust in the long-term nature of our relationship. So let me disabuse you of your terrible idea right now. And even though it was a little painful.
Did he say disabuse you?
Well, it's a bit of a charitable interpretation of how he walked me through a longer, more gentle 20-minute conversation using his Southern charm to let me know that my approach to writing this chapter was awful. And so, it was a little bit tough to hear in the moment, but it was actually also reassuring because I realized, hey, if Donnie's going to give me this kind of honest feedback, it's because he really does value our relationship. And it's because he really wants us to have a good working relationship moving forward. And ever since, this was like really early on in the process. Since then, I really do trust you all to let me know if where I'm heading is right, or if it's like near the mark, or if it's something that I probably should, just kind of put out to pasture and spend my time doing something else. And so it's nice to kind of have like a first stop where I can bounce, and I think we all do this, where we can kind of bounce an early idea off of each other to get quick feedback. And when you have the trust and you have the relationship there, it takes the sting out of it when y'all are like, yeah, I don't know if that's such a good idea. Maybe we should try some other things.
Yeah, I relied on that heavily. First, probably with Ev. is I had lots of ideas, but most of them weren't good ideas. If I hadn't had Ev to help me kind of point me in the right direction, I think I would have wasted a ton of time my first like 4 or 5 years. Even now, I still think I rely really heavily on you two and a variety of other people to just help me answer the question. Like, I'm excited about this now, but will I be later on, with all the work that kind of goes to developing an idea? So yeah, that's really important. Yeah. The other thought I had too is just in the process of learning to write grants and to kind of elevate the quality of your work. I think seeking out feedback from more senior scholars has played a really crucial role in my career. And I mean, the general gist is do the very best work that you can, but get higher quality feedback at a few key points. So if you're doing a paper, get the feedback right before you put your IRB in so that if there are any design issues, you get that feedback when it counts. And then if you include them as a co-author and they're giving you a line edit, probably include them towards the end, and you basically have the paper as strong as you can. But if they see a way that you can strengthen it and give it a better shot at getting published in that outlet, then, it kind of reduces the chance that you wasted an outlet by getting rejected when, you actually could have elevated the quality of your skill. And then the other area is when you're putting together a grant idea, you can include someone as a consultant or a co-I, and a lot of times not have to ask for a lot of their time or energy, but just them giving you feedback at key times will elevate the quality of the project. It will give the project a better chance of getting funded. And this is a little bit of a trick of the trade, but it kind of locks in a commitment of them to you if the project gets funded. And so it's actually kind of amorphous. Are you really committed to mentoring me? Like it's almost similar to kind of DTR in romantic relationships.
For those of you who didn't grow up in Christian subculture, that means define the relationship.
Yeah. If you get a grant together, there is a certain commitment to kind of see through that project. I think that's actually been one of the ways that, you have your primary mentor in a doc program, and usually that person is very committed to you kind of throughout your career. But grants have kind of been a key way to lock in collaborations where you can kind of connect with more senior people and develop that part of your network and kind of know that there's at least a short-term commitment to kind of seeing a project through.
That's a great point, Donnie. It reminds me of early on in my career at UNT. I was having some trouble getting papers placed in top tier journals in my field, like the Journal of Counseling Psychology. And so this is early on, like maybe 2011, 2012. But, we had this idea for a cultural humility paper. We really wanted to place it somewhere good. And so we reached out to Jesse Owen at the University of Denver, who had been really successful at getting things published in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and included him as a co-author. And he really helped us kind of craft the argument and think about like what we needed to put in that paper to have it have a good chance of being successful at that journal.
Yeah, that's good. So I think we've definitely mentioned a variety of benefits. So these are the joys of collaboration. Daryl mentioned the fun. And, we can probably circle back at the end of our conversation and talk about some of the ways to kind of sustain collaborations over time and some of the ways that we've kept the relationship strong at conferences and research retreats, some of those things. But let's dive down into the perils of collaboration, talk about some of the things that can kind of go wrong in that process. What comes to mind?
What initially came to mind for me was actually something that Daryl said, just kind of passed over in his comments about the joys of collaboration. And he was talking about kind of like when the trust is there, then you can do this or that. And I think trust is a big key when it comes to successful collaborations. And if that's not there, I think you can run into some trouble. And this really hasn't happened to me too much, but I've heard stories from colleagues about, collaborations gone wrong where, you were kind of hoping for something like being included on a manuscript, and then it didn't happen, or they kind of collaborators took a left turn, and you were sort of left with nothing. So there are some kind of, sort of agreements that happen that maybe sometimes people don't follow through on, or the project doesn't work out, or things like that. So I think the trust is key.
Yeah, Josh, and I think related to that, one of the perils I see is when there's a mismatch of expectations among people on the project. And so if you, like Josh was saying, if you contributed and you expected to be a certain level of author, or even an author at all, and then you realize, and I mean, this has happened to me before, someone's like, oh, hey, look, you're in the acknowledgements. And I was like, oh, for that contribution, I'm in the acknowledgements.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
Just so you know, no one cares about being in the acknowledgements.
Right.
That sucks.
And so, kind of a remedy to that is, or I think why that happens is because we all naively assume that we're working off of the same set of implicit expectations. And everybody kind of thinks that their way of doing things is how everyone else does things. And as Donnie has alluded to, we have a pretty formalized set of norms when we're working together that I didn't realize other people don't share. And so sometimes an easy way of addressing that peril is to make the implicit explicit. And so when I'm working with a new group of collaborators, what I'll do is I'll say, hey, this is a really awkward conversation because we haven't even got the idea off the ground, but I just want to say, if we move forward, here's my understanding for what authorship is going to be. I want to make sure we're all on the same page for authorship, who's doing what when it comes to authorship. And so sometimes you can have this kind of awkward conversation early, but those few minutes of awkwardness, I assure you, will be better than the months potentially of anxiety or disappointment or frustration when it comes to working on a project and being left out or not going where you thought it was going to go.
Yeah, another thought I had about the perils of collaboration is that, sometimes collaboration can take a lot of time and energy depending on what tasks you are doing as part of the collaboration. And so sometimes it's not always worth the time and effort, depending on the agreement. An example of this is, I remember a project that I collaborated on early in my career where I was tasked with doing some of the data collection for the project. And it was a pretty time-intensive data collection where I actually had to go to a inpatient treatment center and do assessments for the participants who were participating in the study. And it was a fine paper. I was on the paper. I was one of the co-authors, but the amount of time I put into that was just huge. And I think at the end of it, I sort of was feeling like, gosh, I don't know that time commitment was worth, being third author on one paper. So sometimes that's hard to gauge, whether a collaboration is worth it time-wise.
Yeah, I think a few of the what could go wrongs that I've kind of heard about very regularly, especially after graduate school, would include sometimes someone will be asked to run the analyses for a paper and they're second or third author, but it turns out the amount of work that ends up getting put into the paper probably starts to verge on them possibly being first author. So I think there can be times where you basically commit to a role, you don't quite know what you're signing up for, and it turns out in the end that the amount of work you ended up doing, there's an awkwardness of that actually you probably did first author work. I think sometimes there can be a frustration around working style. So particularly in counseling psychology, I think there's a desire to kind of integrate egalitarian values into the process of writing, and kind of sometimes the working out of that can actually lead to a frustrating process. So So, for example, if you tried to evenly split up writing of sections of the paper, sometimes that works. Every once in a while, I've seen that work. Most of the time, it's really hard to execute because some people write more quickly than other people. Some people have a different style than other people. And so if there's even one person that, say works to a deadline and so kind of waits until the week before the deadline is due, it can be really frustrating to, say, someone else on the team who kind of likes to avoid that buildup of a crisis and so I've seen lots of kind of challenges related to the process. So that might be a good segue, actually. So,
can I jump in and share one quick story about that, Donnie? I remember collaborating on I'm kind of an anxious person, so I always get things done ahead of the deadline because I don't like feeling stressed out. And I remember one collaboration where we had a due date on something, and I was waiting for a section from one of the collaborators, and they said something like, it's not a big deal if we missed a deadline, it'll be okay. And I remember said something like, well, I've never missed a deadline, so I don't want to start now. And so, yeah, it was just kind of, just a difference. And sometimes it's hard to, I think, when there is a difference like that, it's easy to judge a difference as right or wrong, versus just kind of accepting the difference.
Yeah, it's almost like having a roommate in undergrad. In a certain way, you do have to kind of work through differences. And, by the time you get to pick your roommate, sometimes you might actually, if you happen to be really neat and you kind of like the room to be clean every night, there might be some choices for collaborators, at least in certain roles, that you might decide they could be a suite mate, but not a roommate, that kind of thing. So, what I was going to kind of segue to is I think it turns out that, so we started working with Ev, I think when he was kind of in his early 60s. So he had kind of figured out almost a writing process and it really developed a whole culture around collaborating that we just kind of walked into and got to kind of figure out our spot. And, it was pretty easy to kind of learn what was expected. I don't think it was until later in my career where I started to realize the many problems that were solved by parts of the process that we learned with him. So I thought it might be helpful just to kind of talk a little bit about that. What are some of the writing norms that we had and we kind of learned as part of Ev's team, and then kind of how we may have done some tweaks as we've gotten into our career. So would one of y'all be up for kind of talking about just what the norms are, and we can kind of go from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the big differences, and we can popcorn this as well, but one of the big differences in our norms, I think from some of the other teams that I've noticed, is we place a pretty heavy emphasis on the first author doing a lot of the work in terms of drafting the manuscript. So, like Donnie was talking about earlier, we don't usually split up different sections, and kind of the reason for that is it's hard to, if you've ever done that before, it's hard to bring it together and make the writing sound like one voice. So, normally the first author takes kind of the lion's share of the work, and then passes it down to the co-authors. We've actually been doing something, a slight tweak to that I wanted to put out, is that a lot of times we'll have the first author write the method and results and kind of the analyses, and then we'll send it around for just a quick look to see if there's any major issues with the analyses and the stats and the hypotheses. And so that can be tweaked before the full paper is written.
Yeah, that's good. Another one is make the line edit. So when the paper comes your way, don't make a comment. It can be incredibly infuriating if you're the first author and you circulate the paper, and another author makes very few actual changes, but about 133 different comments about things that you should do. And one of the things we learned that Ev was saying was, it's actually a lot harder to make the change. And so if you really want the change to be made that badly, you should make the change. So we try really hard not to insert comments unless it's something that we actually cannot change ourselves, like if an analysis needs to be rerun or something along those lines.
And it's always the first author's prerogative. They don't have to accept the change if they disagree with it. But you're right. It just speeds the process so much to have the change actually being made by each of the co-authors.
Yeah, and yeah, also speaking of speed, and I'm not sure if this was an explicit norm. With some papers, I know it was, but I think a norm that we've tried to develop is we try to turn papers around that we're collaborating on in about 2 days. So the best that we can help it, if you can turn around a paper, in 2 business days, people are going to remember, oh, you're a really quick collaborator, and they're going to think of you again in the future. But if yours is the desk that papers go to die, and people are like, oh yeah, you send them a paper and you might get it back in a month or 2, you're not going to keep getting invited to that party. I mean, people are just going to, kind of stop sending you papers. So trying to turn things around quickly also helps keep the process moving along.
And Ev was explicit about that. I remember him saying once that he always prioritizes, his co-authored manuscripts because he just had that value of wanting to get it to the next person and speed through it as quickly as possible. I remember one of those situations where a co-author sat on it for like 3 months, and I was just like, what in the world? Like, what's going on over there? We got to publish this thing. So, Daryl, you're absolutely right. It's annoying when people just sit on their co-authored papers.
I also think we've developed a little bit of a respect for the first author. So if the first author, we submit an idea or a change, and the first author vetoes that, we can ask a question, but we don't usually keep berating or the first author or belaboring the point. We kind of say, like, okay, well, I floated the idea. It's, you decided not to go that way. And then we also try not to gloat if we happen to be right because the paper gets rejected. But, we kind of respect the first author's role and prerogative. And it's it's a very rare case that I can remember among us working together that we've said, hey, I don't feel fair about where I am in the authorship order, or, we kind of try to think about that the first author has been thoughtful about that process, and we try to kind of defer to that person.
Yeah, so I think y'all have kind of named a lot of the process elements of you could almost think of these as like a culture of collaboration. I think what I'll add is over time how I've seen this streamlines the process. And so one aspect is you could kind of look at just one manuscript and be like, okay, it's not clear why this is more efficient than other ways of doing this. But the strong first author, the way that's done, it helps with the process of collaboration, because let's say I'm working on 5 manuscripts and Josh is working on 5 manuscripts. We have very different timelines, but the fact that Josh is going to basically do 90 to 95% of the time share of kind of finishing his 5 manuscripts, he can work on his own timeline. So he may get a ton of time in December, and he may be able to kind of get all those manuscripts ready. And then I may be spacing out my work more. So it actually makes it, if you're going to work with people longer term, then it kind of actually does start to even out the process of the work. Because, part of how it will even out is if you're working with someone and they're putting you on 5 or 10 manuscripts, and you don't give them any manuscripts back, there's an imbalance in that relationship. And so the person can kind of decide if they like that imbalance or not. But it does have a way of kind of evening out over time. And so it's not that it's an unfair process longer term if you're continuing to work with people, but it's actually very efficient. And so even if you had like 10 co-authors on a manuscript, by the time that you go to circulate that manuscript, if people are turning the manuscript around in 2 days, and honestly, I think Daryl was a little bit generous with giving 2 days. I mean, I think in grad school, we would often just get each other the manuscript back in one day, or even, several of us would read the manuscript within a day, just because we liked working with each other and we were prioritizing each other's stuff. So if we got a manuscript from each other, it was on the front of our list to get that back to the other person. And so that felt really good. It feels really good to be on a team where other people are really valuing your work. You've done a lot of hard work to get the manuscript ready. And so they're basically working as hard as they can to get you feedback so that you can kind of move that project forward. So part of how this works is if you have a team that's working together on multiple manuscripts, because it kind of gives a way of coordinating the workflow. So honestly, I haven't found any better way to kind of coordinate workflow on multiple manuscripts than to kind of have a strong first author. Two other things that I would say I've seen that it avoids. So the rule about make the change, don't make the comment, that makes it possible to collaborate with just about anybody. Because some of the most difficult collaborations would happen if someone has a really strong opinion about something, but they don't really have the energy to kind of fix the manuscript. That's a nightmare to kind of work with. So once you have this norm combined with a strong first author norm, what it means is the first author gets the final call, and they get to see exactly what the suggested change was. So there would really never be a situation where you couldn't kind of work through a disagreement because you've got two co-authors kind of at odds about how to handle a decision with a manuscript. Yeah, the last thing I was going to say is sometimes you will see groups have trouble with kind of trust, and you'll see miscommunications around authorship. And so one of the ways that these norms kind of help with authorship considerations is the first author is a strong first author, so they're basically determining the other co-authorships. Usually second author is very clear, and after that, our norms it's kind of first author or bust. And so it's usually pretty clear who the second author might be. After that, we just kind of don't worry about it. These things kind of even out in the end. And so, yeah, I honestly think those three areas are some of the biggest areas where groups can kind of get in trouble with each other. And we walked into a process that helps streamline those things.
Yeah. One thing that Donnie has mentioned before is sometimes people will assume that papers with multiple co-authors mean that the co-authors really aren't pulling their weight, right? They'll just kind of assume like, if you happen to bring the donuts that day, you're on the paper. And I love something that he says that a year on the team will dispel such myths. That is not the case at all. We are a hardworking bunch. And so, and then that could just be other people's norms. Other people who have different ways of kind of approaching papers might be a little bit less clear about what it's like to work in a big collaborative team like we have.
And I guess the other thing I'll chime in on too is I think one adjustment, Josh kind of mentioned it, was say you start to circulate a manuscript and say there's like 4 or 5 authors on it. The one exception we make to kind of the comment rule is sometimes there may be a change where we need to make a more substantial change to the organization of a manuscript, or we need to make a change to the analysis. And to continue to kind of circulate that among co-authors is going to be a waste of the time of other people. So what we try to do in that case is the first author will pull it off and say, okay, I want to address this. They'll either address it themselves or they'll kind of work with the co-author to kind of figure out how to move forward. And then once the change has kind of been made, then they'll kind of continue it down the line of co-authors. So that's something combined with, so part of the reason why we'll run the manuscript by a couple of co-authors, particularly people with expertise on analyses, before we kind of finish out a paper, is if you can kind of nail down the method and results, and you get feedback from the person who's most likely to kind of raise issues with the method and results, then it basically makes it much less likely that you're going to run into, okay, we need to pull this off and kind of do something different with the analysis. So that tweak was really to minimize how many times that once you're kind of circulating it among authors at the end, how many times you kind of need to stop the manuscript.
Can I ask a question? And I don't know if you were thinking about addressing this, Donnie. Do y'all have any thoughts about how to build trust in teams? Like how to get to that point? Like if you have maybe a newer collaboration, what's the process of getting to that point where you do kind of trust each other to maybe have some of these difficult conversations and work out conflict when it happens?
Yeah, Josh, that's a good question. I mean, some of the things that, I've heard people take different approaches. So, I know some people who say, and truly, like this is their MO. They say if you mess up once, they're just done collaborating with you. Like they have like a one strike you're out policy. That's not necessarily me. So what I try to do is I try to give a little bit of a more low stakes thing. So like maybe start a little bit more low stakes, but I'm also, and maybe I just use like a little bit of humor to cut this sometimes. I'll just say like, hey, let's just be really clear about expectations before we go forward. I've had some things in the past, and I know that these are kind of awkward conversations to have, but if we can just be explicit right now. And sometimes I think trust just takes time. Sometimes even when you have trust, you realize it's just not a good fit. And sometimes you'll just have like a one-off or a two-off collaboration with someone. And then, that was good and it was productive for both of you, and you just kind of move forward. And for other people, you realize, oh no, there's the trust there. So for me, I kind of think about if I'm baking the collaboration cake, I think trust is a key, but I also think that like a similar working style or like a fit in kind of process is also a key for me as well. Because there are people that I trust who just take like a long time to get things done.
That's a good point, Daryl. I do think that collaboration is a little bit like dating, in that you'll kind of connect with some people and not others, and that's okay. So that's one thing I would maybe encourage folks is don't give up on collaboration if you've had like a couple bad experiences. It doesn't mean that collaboration is a negative thing on a whole. It just means that those collaborators probably weren't a good fit, and it's okay to kind of have, an experience that wasn't that great and just kind of move on to the next one.
What I would say is I don't know that you can work on trust a whole lot more. It kind of is where it is. I think people earn trust and you kind of get a sense of what you can trust about certain collaborators. So I think what kind of works about the process that we learned with Ev is the role of including someone as a co-author for a line edit is actually a way to feel out what it's like to work with somebody. And then once you kind of get a feel for someone's working style, you can decide whether it's a good fit for other roles. So if you need to rely on someone to kind of be first author in writing up a data set or collecting data, or, there are other roles that require you to put more weight on the relationship. There are other roles where you might need them to coordinate other people, and so do they have the interpersonal skills to kind of navigate working with a team? And so from my perspective, it just takes time and kind of seeing what someone does with opportunities to kind of evaluate trust, and trust builds gradually over time. I think it's actually hard to repair trust. I think it's always hard to repair trust. So once someone, I don't think I have the same mindset as what Daryl described, where it's like one strike and you're out. But I think one strike and it raises a yellow flag. And, I think it can take time to start to feel more confidence for someone if they are kind of consistently falling through. And so that probably speaks to, I think towards the end, we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a good collaborator and kind of how to develop personal qualities and also skills that would make you valuable to a team. And I think it kind of speaks to some of those things. So one thing I did want to address before we kind of move on to some other topics. So we've all had a chance to work on different teams that don't have these kind of, sometimes somewhat rigid rules to kind of help streamline collaboration. So what has y'all's experience been like kind of coming alongside and you realize that there are other writing norms? What have you had to learn in terms of using other writing norms?
I'm a sucker for efficiency, and so I've come to realize that in my experience, the structure that we use tends to be more efficient than other writing norms. Where I've been in projects where everyone on the project wants the data so they can analyze the results, and that's fine, and that people are entitled to do that if they're going to put their name by the data. That slows things down, and that could kind of operate a little bit off of whether or not there's a sufficient amount of trust between everybody. I've been in situations where people are assigned segments or portions to write, and that also kind of requires someone to go back and kind of find a common voice. So all these things are kind of oriented towards the idea that I'm not saying that our way is necessarily the best way, but one of the things that it's very strong on, an advantage of it, is it tends to be fairly efficient.
Any thoughts, Josh?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because we've been using this way so much. I feel like I don't have a lot of experiences or stories of doing it differently. But yeah, I mean, I think, I've had experiences where, we try to work on something and it kind of doesn't get off the ground, because we don't have a clear process, or, it gets bogged down, or, maybe feelings are hurt because there hasn't been clear expectations about authorship or what each person is going to do. And so yeah, some of those things end up kind of bringing up some negative feelings, and then usually it's a one and done collaboration.
Sometimes you can also, I've had collaborations that people would never even know about because it never even resulted in a paper. And sometimes those are really informative collaborations where you think something's going to happen and you think someone's invested, and then a study doesn't turn out. And then the person, and this is fine, but the person's kind of like on to the next thing. And then you're like, oh, well, I guess we had different visions of how long-term our interest in this topic collectively was. And so, yeah, so sometimes collaborations can take lots of different directions before you even get to the point of submitting or even publishing a paper together.
So, I guess what I would say is, as I've watched a few other teams that don't have some of these norms locked in, the main way I would think about it is there's an assumption that I can make when I'm working with you two that I can't make with the other group. So can we assume that the way authorship's going to work is the same? No. So I may have to ask, what's the plan here? What's my authorship? And I may want to make a decision about whether to be involved based on how they plan on handling co-authorship. I may have to ask questions about what's my role. So the way we work, I would never get asked to run all the analyses and write a result section on a paper that I'm not going to be first author on, because that's kind of, unless we specifically talk about it, that would be first author work. And so I've realized that sometimes you can't necessarily assume some of those things, and there can be a little bit, kind of less clarity around what the roles are. And I would say the other thing that I've kind of just had to be more cautious around is we have norms related to giving each other feedback, where we basically, it's just generally assumed that you're being a good citizen if you give very direct feedback. You put on the hat of a reviewer that's going to be critical, and we basically try to anticipate that critique and think about how to reduce the risk of that being something that would kind of keep the paper from being published. So we don't generally get our feelings hurt if someone tells us, hey, this is a weakness of the paper, because it's generally assumed, oh, you're actually helping me avoid a rejection from a journal that I want to get this published in. So there's not much work to kind of establish trust that the negative comment was actually for the good of the paper and actually meant to be a positive thing. So if I'm working with a new team, I don't assume, what the nature of kind of giving feedback is. And I don't assume we'll usually make changes. So if you're working with a team that uses more comments, it can actually offend someone if you write over their writing. And so if you totally rewrite something for them and that's not the norm of the team, then it can actually really come across like you're an arrogant person, like you would basically write over someone. And I think there are even some identity aspects of that. So I'm a white male. If I write over someone's writing and it's not part of the norms and say it's a woman or a woman of color, that can actually be very offensive if you haven't picked up on the writing norms of another team. So those are a few things that kind of come to mind for me of just being aware that whatever process you use for writing, there are some cultural aspects to that process. And it's not that there's any one way that's right or wrong, but sometimes it takes some kind of cultural flexibility to kind of pick up the norms of another team and to be able to kind of work well with other groups.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for highlighting that, Donnie.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so a couple of quick areas to kind of end on. Anything y'all would add? We had talked some at the beginning of just kind of what you can do to be a good citizen. I mean, part of it is just knowing your own strengths and developing those strengths. But anything else you would say in terms of kind of being a good citizen or kind of making yourself valuable for collaboration, especially for early career folks?
So something that I'll give Josh the credit because he was the one that highlighted this earlier. I would think about where you are and like what's kind of unique about what you have to offer. So I think Josh had mentioned this. So y'all are both at big state schools, huge participant pools. I'm at a small undergraduate only college. So I can't come to collaborators and woo them with my sample size, right? I can't say like, oh, we could collect 1,000 people this semester. But what I could say is, we've got a pretty engaged we have a pretty engaged participant pool. And I've got a pretty good lab and I've got a pretty good physical lab structure and setup that if you need to run an intensive study and you want about, 150 to 200 people in an intensive study from participants who are pretty engaged, we can do that. Like if you want to study something religiously related, a lot of my participants are pretty committed religious participants. What do we want to go with? So kind of knowing what you have to offer and trying to make the most of that. And then like both of y'all said, realizing what are your strengths and then playing into those strengths.
Kind of building off that. And I think you might have mentioned this previously, Donnie, but developing areas of expertise of things that you can bring to the table that might be unique. So, for example, like learning different statistical analyses that, you might be able to contribute with. So, I remember, I took a course on structural equation modeling. And so then that was like a new tool that I could use and help out with. Or I took a course on meta-analysis. And so that was a new tool that I could use to help out with on papers. Donnie has, developed some expertise in latent profile analysis. That's not something I know how to do. But so when I have a paper that I thought, maybe that could use latent profile analysis, then I kind of bring in Donnie. And so, I mean, I would probably bring in Donnie anyway, but it's something to think about. Like if you're wanting to be a good collaborator, like what do you have to bring to the table that's unique? Daryl is really good at running experimental studies. So if I have a paper that's like, I think this really could use a lab study, Daryl's kind of my go-to.
Yeah, that's really good. I think y'all are kind of naming a lot of the things that I would think of. I mean, I definitely think in a doctoral program, you might be tempted to take courses on, say, family counseling or this and that. Content area stuff actually isn't going to add a lot to your value to a writing team. It really, one of the biggest areas you can make an early kind of contribution is if you can learn the cutting edge methodology statistically. A lot of times people with conceptual expertise, they haven't they don't have the energy to kind of keep track of, 15 different cutting edge statistical methods. So if you can kind of learn those things quickly, learn how to kind of identify an expert in your department who can teach you something, you can teach yourself, and then you can apply it. A lot of times there's room to kind of quickly make a contribution to a team. I think there's something similar with measurement expertise where pretty much any area, if you can make an innovation in the measurement strategy being used in that field, you can generate new data that's going to kind of require integration with prior theory. And so I think there are a few methodological areas to invest in early career. You can be a hard worker who basically turns things around quickly and is willing to kind of do whatever it takes. I think if you get a reputation for that and kind of being easy to work with, that can really be very helpful. The other thing I would say that I've kind of done at Georgia State, and I think it kind of is similar to what Josh and Daryl were saying, is you may have institutional strengths that you can basically bring back to the group. So at Georgia State, they pay for tuition if a grant will basically pay for the stipend. And so I can basically help generate in-kind support for grants. So I've worked out a relationship with my chair where a lot of times on a grant project, I can work with my chair to generate in-kind support. So in-kind support is just where the university is providing some of the funds that contribute to the project. And a lot of grant foundations will actually prefer a project that's more cost effective. And so there are similar things you can do relationally. So for example, like in our department, Ken Rice is really, really good at like various methods with M+. And so I've worked on developing a relationship with Ken where I try to minimize how much time I ask for from him. And so I try to create a win-win, but I've tried to include perfectionism measures in some of the studies that we've done. And so I'm trying to kind of do something that would benefit his research program. And then also, we have a friendship that we enjoy, and he's able to help me learn methods more quickly or give me feedback on something that would take me much more time to kind of have that kind of expertise. So I think when you're in your first 10 years of a position, just kind of keeping an eye out for things that would strengthen projects that you're a part of. And if you're working on if you're working on a team of 2 or 3 people who are all doing that and basically kind of trying to bring back value to the team, if everyone's doing that, then what kind of happens is the whole team is stronger.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
So one last area, when do y'all say no to projects? What would you say to kind of early career folks, people in a doc program, maybe in their first 3 or 4 years while they're working on getting tenure? And then, how has that changed as you've gotten past tenure? When do you say no?
This is an interesting question. And I think historically, I really didn't say no very much. And I pretty much said yes to whatever opportunity for collaboration came across my desk. And there was something I think probably good about that, in that I got on a lot of different projects, was able to do a lot of different types of things. There were some limitations to that as well. I remember getting some feedback from my, when I was going up for mid-tenure review and different things like that, I was pretty scattered in my research. Like I didn't have as focused of a research area as maybe they wanted me to have. And kind of a blanket yes also put me in some situations like what I talked about before, where it may be like I was doing too much work on a collaboration for what I was getting out of it. So as I have gotten older and more further along in my career, I think I still say yes a lot, just because I'm kind of curious and interested in a lot of different things, and I think that's okay. But I'm doing a better job of gauging, what exactly is going to go into this collaboration in terms of my own time, energy, and effort. And so that, if the effort that's required of me is pretty minimal, like giving a line edit on a paper, or maybe, giving some feedback on conceptual stuff. Like I'm still pretty much usually say yes to those types of things. Where I'm more cautious on is if it's a big time investment, like, wanting me to do a data collection effort, or help out with a data collection effort at UNT, just because those things take a lot of time and energy. So for kind of the really heavy time investment stuff, I usually only say yes if I personally just really want to do it, or it's, very kind of key to my career development and things like that.
Yeah, Josh. I think I follow a similar strategy. I think I do a cost benefit analysis of like, am I personally interested in it? Do I think it would be enjoyable? Like I tend to say yes to stuff y'all ask me to do because I like working with y'all. I think I tend to be a little bit more cautious about roles. Like when people want me to take on a certain role, I think I'm a little bit more cautious, and I think that out more than just like, would you be willing to join a paper? I think working through a paper, again, depending on who all is involved, is a little bit lower of an investment than if someone's asking me to play a particular role. Well, if someone says, hey, I want you to join this grant on something that they wouldn't say this to me, that I'm not super interested in, I haven't done any research on, and it's a lot of heavy lifting. I'm like, well, I'm not sure if that aligns with what I really want to do, versus, hey, do you want to like contribute to a paper? That's like a lower bar for me. So I like to make sure that I have time and energy to do things that align with like my professional trajectory, like questions I'm really interested in asking. But similar to you, Josh, I enjoy working with other people and different ideas, and I resonate with being curious about different topics.
The time is limited, though. I think you make a good point in that with Daryl. Yeah. And I think sometimes I've struggled in the past about saying yes to too many things, and then I really don't have the time to push forward the projects that I really am personally interested in. So I think that's maybe an area of caution. And I think it does depend on where you are in your developmental level too. Like I think early career or in graduate school, part of me was just wanting to get a lot of stuff on my CV so I could be competitive for a job. Now later on, I don't necessarily have that need as much, so I'm a little bit more selective.
Right. Like and I know maybe this is strange that it's taken me this long to get to this point, but I've got a book that that's under contract that I have to submit by next fall, and so I'm taking December and January just to work on the book. So I've had a number of people reach out to me and say, hey, would you be willing to do this project? And I've said, you know what? I'm not doing anything until the end of January. Like, just don't contact me until February. And lo and behold, every single person was like, oh yeah, no problem. I'll just contact you in February. And I was like, wow, I guess I do have more control over my time. So I think the other place I say no is when I feel like I'm kind of getting out of balance. Like my personal life is kind of getting crunched, or I'm persistently stressed out about work. Then I might start saying no a little bit just to put in a little bit more breathing room.
Yeah, this is all very helpful. And I mean, as I think back on it, there's definitely been a shift for me that happened in the last 3 or 4 years. I remember probably all of grad school, and probably for 2 or 3 years after that, I was wide open in terms of wanting to form collaborative relationships with people in the field. I was like, I really wanted to meet other people, and I had enough energy probably to do, I didn't need to say no, actually. The way that we collaborated, and a lot of other professionals did something somewhat similar. And so as long as I wasn't signing up for data collection or running the analyses, which usually, if you're working with strong collaborators, that's a grant. Like usually there's a grant role. And so there's usually funding that would be associated with those roles. And so in a certain way, as long as I wasn't being asked to do data collection or run the analyses, then I would be a co-author on anything. And to be honest, I don't know that I've ever really shifted from that, because it's almost like a good way of, it's a combination of networking and using your expertise to strengthen other people's projects, and reading about work that's generally in your area, because people aren't going to ask you to be a co-author on something that's totally unrelated. So I've kind of kept the co-authorship thing more open, but I've gotten pickier about making sure that someone's not asking me to do major heavy lifting in terms of data collection or analyses. It's been more of a process to kind of narrow a strategy of what to say no to in terms of priority projects. And for me, the dialectic there is, if you don't form relationships and explore, then you could potentially limit your ability to kind of form stronger teams and do cooler projects. Because if you're not getting out there and you're not meeting people, it's cool that you saved all your time, but what you have an ability to do is, possibly limited. If you were in a field like poetry or, maybe that would be the ideal way to go. But we're actually in a field where the quality of your projects is partially related to the quality of the teams that you're able to kind of be a part of. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there, but and I think all three of us are kind of starting to get to this point where we're turning the dial back a little bit, in terms of, we actually need to protect our time more for kind of our first authored work and our highest priority projects. And so for me, the other threat to that is I really like mentoring and kind of investing in doc students and kind of that role. There's a little bit of a dispersion of energy. So students have interest, and you're actually helping them develop their own research programs. And so there's a little bit of a need to kind of find a balance between how much energy you give to things that are kind of diffusion of your energy, and how much you reserve for kind of your highest priority projects. So that's kind of how I would articulate that. And it's gotten hardest for me post tenure, and probably a year or two after that. I've had to think. I think my first 2 or 3 years, I didn't really have to think much about that. I was basically, the things I would say no to would mainly just be projects that weren't related to papers and weren't going to kind of be helping towards the process of getting tenure. Post tenure, there's actually things that I want to be involved in that may not necessarily lead to publications, and they may be longer term investments. And so it's a little bit harder to decide which of those things you want to invest in, because it almost requires you to kind of think about what your values are and kind of what you want in a career and some of those bigger picture things.
Yeah, that's good. I like that.
Do y'all have trouble saying no? I think some people who might listen to this might just find the process of saying no hard. Do y'all find it easy enough to say no to somebody if you don't want to do something?
No. I could be a lot better. That's why I was like, oh my gosh, I can say no and people are okay. I think I have to quell the voice inside my head that says, like, if I say no to this, no future opportunities will come, right? Like, it's kind of like working out of like a scarcity mindset. Like, the only reason opportunities have come was because I like indiscriminately said yes. And that's probably a little bit, I just need to mature my thinking a little bit to realize that no, I can actually be strategic in when I say yes or no, and opportunities will continue to come even if I have to say no on occasion.
I think I do struggle to say no sometimes. And I think it's, I don't know why. I think there's like a guilty part of me that I have a tendency toward, where I feel bad about saying no or helping out with different things. So yeah, I do struggle with that sometimes. I think it's gotten a little easier for me now that I'm married and I have a kid. And so I feel like, I don't know, maybe like more justified to say like, hey, no, I don't have time for this. I'm sorry.
So is that like the take home message for listeners? Like, if you want to say no, you need to make like some major life transitions.
There is a sense that, that I feel like people react a little better to no's when it's more like I can't versus I won't.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. So I don't know if, take that for what it's worth. But I found that the no comes across a little better if I'm like, I'm sorry, I really don't have the bandwidth to take this on right now because of this or that, versus I could do this, but
I don't want to. Yeah. I mean, I think the general logic of saying no that works is I have a prior commitment. And so I think in some ways there are reasons that you can give someone that actually they're kind of untouchable. So yeah, I have a newborn and I'm really trying to prioritize time with a newborn. Like that's a little bit untouchable. Like I think a lot of times family is kind of untouchable. So there's the reason that you give and whether someone kind of honors that. And then, I think another part of the process is just, do you feel okay about your reasons and what your priorities are? And I think if you go into a conversation and you're not clear on that, then it makes it harder to say no. I think for me, I don't think I struggle as much with that. Usually I'm clear on the role that I want. So I usually just the way I think about it is, what do I want to do? Where's there a win-win? And usually I can find a role that I'm okay with, and I'll just put that out there. And if that's okay for someone, then, we'll move forward. If it's not, then we don't. So I usually kind of think of it that way. But I think there are probably some ways where I've said yes to things just because I didn't clarify my priorities. And I think that's probably an ongoing process. Like if I look at my current list of commitments, there's some things that I'm working on that I'm like, I don't know if I could sign up for this today. I don't know that I would re-sign up for this commitment. And so I think I'm trying to get better at making sure that the things that I commit substantial amounts of time to, that they're close enough to my values that a year later, they would still kind of make that list. Cause I don't like to start something that I'm not going to finish, but anyway, so that for me, that's kind of the challenge of it.
One quick thing related to what you said, Donnie, is when saying no, I think sometimes I think I struggle with saying no because I haven't gotten really clear with myself about what I want in a situation. Or maybe I'm like wishy-washy about like whether I should make the commitment or not. And then if I'm in that place, I'm more likely to get swayed by what the other person wants. And so it's been important for me to be like, okay, when thinking about a commitment, let's get really clear with myself about what I want in this situation and whether I want to say yes or no. And maybe I need to talk it over with someone or talk it over with my wife and kind of get clear about whether this is something that we want to commit to. And then I can go into the conversation with clarity and say no, and this is the reason.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say with if anybody does kind of struggle with that skill, one thing that you can always do, I've heard a few people talk about something like this, is you can always basically tell someone, this is really interesting, let me think about this. Or you can say, this is really interesting. I have a group of people that I kind of run my primary commitments by. So let me kind of check in with them and I'll get back to you. And I mean, there are basically a few things you can do to basically give yourself the time to really consider whether it's a good fit. And I think getting in the habit of kind of taking that pause, even if you're going to end up saying yes, it can kind of also just teach people, hey, this is a person who takes their commitment seriously and they're not going to just sign up for something before they've thought it through. And so I don't know many people who would kind of push through that kind of message. And honestly, there are some pushy people out there that if you tell them no, they'll still try to kind of say a couple things. I mean, I think you have to kind of get to a place where you can stick with a no, even for someone who is kind of pushing. So
I love that idea about the advisory team sort of thing. There was I don't know if you remember this, Donnie, but we were on a grant or we were preparing a grant, and there was this kind of thought leader that we wanted to be a consultant on the grant. He really didn't have to do that much. But he said that he's like, I have an advisory team that I have to run every commitment by and see if it's aligning with my values and priorities. And then he came back to us and he said, sorry, it's a great idea, but I can't commit to that. I checked with my advisory team, and I can't do it. And I was kind of frustrated that he said that, but then I was like, man, how cool is that he has such a process for figuring out what his values are and what his priorities are, and that he is firm in sticking to that. So I had a lot of respect for that.
Yeah, and it kind of felt like he took the opportunity seriously too. So I mean, it kind of it even had a interpersonal kind of positive aspect, where if he had just said no in a quick email, it might have almost seemed to us like, he had just reflexively said no because he's really busy. But there was something about the fact that he took time and talked with the group about it that made it seem like, he really was considering it. So I think there is something to learn from that of how to say no. Carlene, my partner, like, we'll often talk about major time commitments with each other. So that's something I can say is, this sounds like a big deal. Let me check with my family about this, and I'll circle back. I'm really interested, but let me check back. And I may already know that I'm going to say no, or I'm highly likely to. I don't necessarily owe a person all the details of my process. It just kind of gives a little bit of a buffer. So I think that's the biggest thing I would suggest to people is just kind of have a way ahead of time that you can say, I'm going to think about this, that is honoring of the person's request. And, you can express gratitude for the opportunity, but then give yourself some space to kind of decide what you really want to do.
And there's sometimes that I've even used Donnie and Daryl, so professional colleagues, to talk about this. Like I remember, a year or so ago, I was feeling a little pressure to do something, and I called up Donnie and said, what do you think about this? Do you think this is a good use of my time? And Donnie's like, no, I would never do that. And so it gave me a little bit more confidence to be like, what, that really isn't in my best interest to say yes to. So yeah, utilize your support systems.
Yeah, and we have different interpersonal strengths. Daryl is definitely the peacekeeper of our group, and Josh, Josh is a peacekeeper too, and very kind of pragmatic in professional relationships, and so I think people are getting kind of overlapping feedback of you're much stronger as a team and kind of being able to kind of share perspectives. I almost always, if there's kind of conflict and I'm trying to kind of smooth things over, I just think about what Daryl would do, and it helps give me a better frame of mind.
Well, whenever I'm trying to be assertive, I think of what would Donnie do. So I'm glad that we have that reciprocity.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So, one thing we haven't talked about, we usually have like an annual research retreat. So another way that we kind of enjoy collaborating and continue to build trust and just have fun is we have like a yearly research retreat. And so Donnie was being very kind and also direct and trying to help me be more assertive. That was not something I've been very strong at. And so he took it into his own hands to really put the pressure on me to assert. And he knows that I tend to kind of go with the flow and just kind of let other people make decisions. So we were at a research retreat and we drove into town, and Josh really wanted to eat like a Chinese buffet or something. And Donnie really just wanted to go to Chipotle. And they were just going at it. Like, they were arguing. Like, somewhat playful, but also kind of somewhat forcefully. Like, Josh really did not want to eat at Chipotle. And I'm in the front seat, and I'm having like a panic attack because, your friends are just, kind of arguing about food. And so Donnie just really turns the screws, and he says, okay, Daryl, we obviously can't decide. You're the tiebreaker. You have to pick where we eat. And you see that Chipotle down there? It's 3 blocks away. If you don't decide by the time we drive near that Chipotle, I'm pulling in, and that's where we're going to eat. And so Josh is clamoring from the back seat. Donnie's driving faster than ever. My, blood pressure is like 200 over 150. And so finally I just exclaimed, we're eating at that steakhouse. And they were just shocked. Like, that wasn't even on the table. So Donnie pulled in. The whole meal, I just was sweating bullets. I didn't know if anybody liked it. And at the end, they were like, Yeah, that was okay. It was good. I was glad we got a steak. And ever since then, I've been assertive. No, I'm kidding. But that was one of the, that's me trying to be more. Iron sharpens iron. So I try to remind myself, what would Donnie do in this situation? And I do that thing.
Daryl, you mentioned the research retreat thing. I mean, that probably is a good topic to kind of end on. I mean, what would y'all say? I don't know that we did that on purpose per se. It kind of evolved somewhat organically, and I think it's kind of shifted roles a little bit over time even. I mean, what would y'all say the value of what we did with the research retreat was? And I mean, I guess the follow-up question we might want to kind of consider is like, how could other people draw something from that? So, I mean, we're a group of, we were 3 guys that went through grad school together. Obviously, that same model might not necessarily work with all groups, all teams, and all kind of friend groups. So yeah, what do y'all think the value of that was?
I mean, a couple thoughts I had. I mean, I think there's something to be said about kind of getting out of the normal kind of day-to-day process and just having some extended time to focus on your work and to think and to dream and to plan. So, I think at the beginning, the research retreat was very kind of more pragmatic. Like, okay, what projects are we working on this year? And then as it's gone along, I think it's been a little bit more general. Like what are some of our what are like our higher order priorities, and kind of like where are we going as a team? So I think there's importance of just unplugging a little bit and having some extended time to do that, because I think we don't usually do that on a day-to-day basis because we're dealing with so much kind of day-to-day urgent stuff. And I think the other thing kind of relates to some of the stuff we've been talking about, just of trust. And I think you just need some extended time sometimes to hang out. And I think you can't rush relationships. I think, I remember once in college, and I just kind of like looked around at one point in college and realized, I was so close with these friends, and I almost like wasn't aware of like how that had happened. But I think it was just, spending time together. And then all of a sudden, you kind of realize that the closeness is there. And it's fun. I think that's another thing about research retreat, that it's just it's a blast to, usually we try to go someplace cool where there's like hiking or different stuff to do, or boating or whatever. So there's part of it, just you can't work all the time. So
yeah, I mean, I think Josh, you nailed it. Like early on, it was, we were making lists and setting goals, and I still look toward that as kind of like a natural kind of break in my academic year. Like to me, research retreat kind of like ends one year and begins another one. And I really use that as like a way to kind of set the vision for what am I thinking for the next year or a couple years. And then, it's just also so much fun just to be able to connect with good friends that we've had for, as Donnie said, almost 15 years. But if you're I mean, I think a challenge is how could you translate that to other working groups or other teams? And you don't necessarily have to go get a cabin and hike in the woods like we do. That just might not work. But you could think about kind of an annual time, whether it's virtually or whether it's in person, like a day or two, where you use it to kind of reflect on what worked well in the past and set a vision for what you're thinking about toward the future. And it's a good accountability to kind of say like, hey, what have you done? What haven't you done? And I always leave getting more excited about stuff that I'm working on and where I'm heading. And so even just kind of knowing that that's on the calendar can often be a help.
Yeah, I agree with that, Daryl. Like, I think if I think about other projects I've been a part of, there have been a few things that approximated a similar role as what we do with Research Retreat. So, I mean, I think the ERPS meeting has a similar role where there's an opportunity to bring formative work and get feedback from a smaller group of people, but then there's also space for friendships to develop, to do fun things, and to kind of be off the clock with each other and to kind of get to know each other outside of like a hyper professional context. And I think the reason that piece is so important is it kind of speaks to that trust piece. I read a book called Speed of Trust by Covey, and he basically says everything takes longer if you don't have a lot of trust. So like, for example, if we're laying out a grant and we generally trust, okay, we're going to divide things somewhat evenly, it'll work out. If someone else picks up more of a role, okay, these things kind of have a way of working themselves out. If there's a foundation of relationship there, it just smooths out all of the communication, any types of miscommunication that could happen. There's a context to kind of work through those kinds of things. And so there's just all of these, kind of thousands of little small things that get easier when there's an ease and there's kind of a context of trust with each other. So that's why I think it's so important. I think there are a few parts that even compared to ERPs or like, Josh, I'm thinking of that intellectual humility project. I think there were aspects of the way that we would go to Palm Springs and kind of connect with each other and more work happened outside the meeting than inside the meeting. There's something that there was kind of a little bit of a magic that would happen and really Zoom or something like that couldn't really approximate it. And then I think there's a piece where, it's the long-term aspect. So it's just kind of rare that you cultivate relationships where, I'm almost thinking of like Scott Stanley had a line of work on commitment where he basically talked about commitment is kind of the sense that this relationship's going to continue indefinitely. I think when you get to a place where you really do have a psychological sense that these are really important relationships, I don't really see any end to these relationships. One way or the other, these are going to continue to be important. There's certainly effectiveness and lots of professional benefit to that, but in a certain way, the part that is even more meaningful is it increases the purpose and the meaning of your work, both with each other and, I would honestly say I would enjoy my career much less if I didn't have those kinds of relationships. So,
yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably not a better place to end.
It's true. With gratitude for both of you.
Yeah, very grateful for our years together and our indefinite future.
That's right.
No end in sight.